Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbites. Joining me tonight is Ben Kinsley, Executive Director for Campaign for Vermont, and my co-host and co-producer. And joining me on my left is my longtime dear friend, I wish we could hug, Keith Goslant, who is an LGBTQ advocate and the co-host of All Things LGBTQ, which is a show that's here on ORCA. You co-host with Ann Charles and Linda Quinlan.
That is correct.
It's an excellent show, and we'll talk about it in just a minute. But first, we always ask our guests to tell a little bit about themselves.
Sign in, please.
Yes, really. Let's not get too much into how we know each other, but let them know a little about you.
There are certain things that remain private.
Exactly.
I grew up in Plainfield, very close to here. Both of my parents were very active in our community. They were those people who were always looking at, how can I contribute? What can I do to be helpful to my neighbor? What is it that I can do to give back for what I have? I mean, we were one of those families that, I remember one Thanksgiving, we looked up on the local church wall and there were people who had no place to go.
Oh.
So it was like, come eat with us.
Nice.
You can be part of our family. So that instilled a sense of community involvement and activism at a very young age. I was very involved with my high school. Goddard was right next door, so I was involved with some of the activities that were happening there. And as I grew older, I won't say I grew up.
And don't ever.
Exactly. I don't think it's going to happen.
No, I don't think
so. If it hasn't happened for us by now, it's not going to. But I had gone to work at the Vermont State Hospital. And then I started looking around for other things that I can do to contribute to my community. How do I continue to grow as a person? And it was at that point in time that the HIV and AIDS epidemic was just starting. And here in Vermont, there were a group of us from within the LGBTQIA communities, that's the tagline you can use from now on, who were looking at, we want to bring about change. And rather than following one of the models that was happening on the national level, where it was sort of a grassroots guerrilla street activism, by virtue of Terry Anderson, who is very involved in the Democratic Party, being part of this process, we said, we want to make a commitment to doing this within the mainstream political process. And as I'm frequently told, no good deed goes unpunished. That was 1985. I continued very active, involved in legislation at the State House, helped to form numerous LGBTQIA community-based nonprofit organizations such as Vermont Cares, Outright Vermont. And
but meanwhile, you were working.
I was still working at the State Hospital. And one of the advantages I had is I worked in the admissions department. I worked on the afternoon shift, so I could spend my mornings doing activism. And I had the support of my employer to be able to do this. And one of the things that I also had that some other people didn't is I had the full support of my family.
Great.
They always made me feel included and as though I was very actively a member.
That's great. I think that's key, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, Keith and I actually met when I was Commissioner of Personnel. We started the very first affirmative action EEO group.
Council.
You acted council, and Randy Sandler and I, she was with the tradeswoman group.
Yes.
And we started it, and Governor Dean appointed you, and that's really where, although I worked with your dad before
This is true.
But that's where we met, and we've been friends ever since.
And he still talks fondly of you.
Does he?
Absolutely.
We'll have to talk to him. When we meet in Price Chopper, it's a hoot. So right.
She stalks me in the fresh produce aisles. I love it.
We're all hugging and carrying on.
There we are.
But anyway.
Right? You run into everyone at the grocery store.
Exactly.
So you were very gracious to say that you would share this story. You're obviously a well-known advocate, you're openly gay, but you had a horrendous experience directly with homophobia. And we talked a little bit about everybody's doing the hashtag Me Too, of which I put mine out very early on. And I think it would
Thank you.
Oh, well, I wouldn't talk about it, but I'll say, I'll raise my hand. I would find hard, and I think that's the problem. People find it hard to talk about it.
Well, and also, when you asked if we could include this, you did that in a very respectful and supportive manner.
Well,
And thank you.
you're
I
welcome.
appreciate
Well,
that.
I didn't want to put you on the spot, but if you could share with folks, 'cause I
It's-
don't know how many, that was a while ago, and I remember
I was 18 years old,
Yeah,
and I've talked about this in sexual violence forums, and for a couple of reasons. One is we don't talk about sexual violence against male survivors often. We do not talk about gay male survivors of sexual violence, where it pretty much is a hate crime. And we don't talk about that survivor process, And the more you talk about it, actually, the more you normalize it for yourself. It is no longer this big secret. I don't have to spend all of this energy trying to hide it. I spent 30 years not telling anybody. And the event that had occurred was I was just walking on the streets, and it was a group of 5 men, late adolescents. They were drinking, they were just out to have fun. And in a sort of classic hate crime scenario, if it had been just one person, they probably wouldn't have done it. But it was all 5
Yeah.
together, so
Right.
they pumped themselves up. And as I've said in public forums, I became the evening's entertainment. And I'm sure that to the 5 of them, they don't even remember it. It really doesn't mean anything. But to me, it had a lasting impact. I still have to confront it at times, when I am in very loud environments where there's lots of drinking going on and sort of energy where people are losing control. I kind of I don't feel comfortable here and I
Yeah.
want to leave. And then also working through all of those issues with personal relationships. Can I trust you?
right.
And actually, one of the things that you already alluded to makes an incredible difference in people's ability to survive something such as this. If you have a supportive family or social network where you can go back and feel protected and supported, that's what helps you in your ability to go forward. Looking at some of the recent study with ACEs, Adverse Childhood
Right.
Encounters,
Right.
some of the kids where they expected to find, just numerous psychological and physiological problems, they weren't there. And they were trying to figure out, what did we miss? Well, what they missed was the child went back to a mother who embraced and loved them. And that's what made the difference.
Because I do remember seeing the newspaper, I don't know whether you had showed me, but somewhere I remember that, and that picture stood in my mind these many years, so,
Thank you.
well,
Well, and I think it's interesting too because the Me Too hashtag, there are men that are coming forward
Right.
and saying, "Hey, me too. I'm a victim of, sexual assault or whatever." And we often as a society tend to think about it as a women's only
Yeah.
issue, and it's not. And the other interesting thing that I heard in the past week was that we do think of it as a women's issue, sexual assault and
Domestic
gender
violence.
and domestic violence.
Intimate partner
Intimate
violence.
part, right?
That's one of those
Yeah.
correct.
please,
That's one of
what
those.
is that? I have to
That's
learn
one of those
something else.
corrections.
What is it, intimate partner what?
Intimate partner violence is the current
Oh, is that right? I better get with the
definition.
program.
And it sort of can encompass everything from sexual violence through to domestic assault.
Right.
So,
Wonderful.
as I've interrupted you,
No,
which I'm noted
please,
for
thank you.
doing.
I do the same thing, so it's okay. But I think it's interesting. So that I heard another perspective on this is that it's not, and I'll get back around. It's not actually a women's issue because women, in the broader sense, are not usually the perpetrators; they're the victims. So really, it's a men's issue. Even though we think about it as being a problem for women, it's actually the men that are and so they're the
Power
ones
and
that
control.
that's right. They're the ones that are the problem,
Yeah.
and so it kind of switches the dynamic a little bit. But the same concept applies to, I think, violence around gender bias or whatever. Is that you think of it as this is a problem that people in this community have to deal with. But really, the problem is not with them. The problem is people who are espousing and saying or doing things.
And there's such a climate for it.
Right.
Actually, the Centers for Disease Control, which is that federal agency in Atlanta that we don't like to talk about
Right,
too
right.
much because they're not fun people.
No, they're not.
They just released their intimate partner violence study, or their statistics for the last year. Bisexual women have the highest incidence of intimate partner violence, substantially above straight
Really?
women.
So the two of us, just watched Ben's face. We were like, what?
Really?
Yeah.
Well, it's one of those that is actually a part of all of our communities that has felt the least degree of inclusion by anybody.
Oh.
So they're sort of out
So
there.
they're out there all by themselves.
And part of the power and control is you're worth less than I am, so I'm entitled to do this. So that plays into it. Gay men have a higher incident of violence than straight men, and lesbians more than straight women.
As the victim?
Yes,
yeah,
as
okay.
the victim.
All right.
Not as the perpetrator.
Okay, yeah.
If it was a perpetrator, I'd couch the language a little differently.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
But no,
That's supportive.
looking at victim survivors.
That makes sense.
Interesting.
Sadly.
Yeah.
Well, and part of it is when we were doing the prep for the show, there were so many things to talk about that fall under this umbrella. But one of the things we want to talk about was the show that you have right here on ORCA, which is All Things LGBTQIA.
The only use is LGBTQ.
Okay, all right.
You can look right over at the
Because
sign.
they-
It's okay.
That I've got memorized. You just added a few more letters.
I know, right? I have to keep up.
Yeah.
So we're curious about why you started it. What was the inspiration, as well as the type of stories that you tell, and the co-hosts. So there's some really interesting stuff that you're doing.
We have a good time.
Yeah.
It was actually the idea of Linda Quinlan, who is one of the co-hosts. She and her partner, Ann Charles, they've been together for 35 years.
Good job.
I know.
I didn't pick up that they were partners. They're just very professional.
We talk about it occasionally, 35 years.
Oh, no kidding.
They had an anniversary
them.
recently. But they have been involved in founding the Rainbow Umbrella of Central Vermont, which is an LGBTQIA social group. And they formed because they were feeling this sense of isolation. Why am I having to drive to Burlington for everything? Where is my sense of community and family here?
Right.
And from that, they were looking at, who's talking about the news stories either about us or that are important to us or have an impact on us? And some of it was looking at international news where Anne is the person who reports, and she's frequently talking about sort of the Eastern African nations where if you were found to be gay, it could be a death penalty. Mm-hmm. During the height of sort of the ISIS conflict, they were holding gay men by their ankles over the top of a building and saying, plead for your life, and then dropping them. There were certain cultures where your family is encouraged to turn you in, or your family is actually encouraged to drop you off the building. And then also looking at the positives, like Malta, which I hadn't really thought about Malta a lot, but they've done a lot of very progressive, proactive, pro-LGBTQIA legislation, reporting on those things. And then on a national basis, there were over 175 anti-LGBTQ pieces of legislation that were introduced on the state level across the U.S. during the last legislative session. That's an incredible amount of bills.
Yeah, that's staggering.
So the laundry
and
list
tracking that,
every other week is incredible.
Texas alone, I think, accounts for 3/4 of them.
What a surprise.
And Mississippi, I'm shocked.
Yeah.
But then also reporting on the positive things. There's a lot that is happening on municipal and state levels in states. There was the marriage equality that happened at the Supreme Court level. And that's what Linda reports on. And she does some celebrity gossip because you got to have some,
It is.
some real trash every now and then.
Yeah, keeps it interesting.
It keeps me amused. And then I talk about local and regional, and then I also do look at healthcare issues, HIV related. These are the tests that you should be having if you're engaging in these types of practices. Part of your annual physical needs to be this. And it's just letting people know this is what's happening. And then we do interviews. We look at people from within the LGBTQIA community in Central Vermont and Vermont in general. Our out legislators, having them come in and talk with us. What are you supporting? Why did you run for office? what has your experience been like as an LGBTQIA candidate and elected official? And then we do what we started calling our trivia question, because we were amazed at how many people from within our own communities didn't know our own history.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, it was interesting. Part of it was precipitated when I went to the inauguration on a state level this year, and I was standing in line to congratulate your boy Phil.
There you go. Thank you.
You're welcome. And as I was getting closer, I could see his security guard sort of look at me, and I recognized that am I a threat? And when I got closer to him, he leaned in and said, "Does the pink triangle have a meaning?"
Oh.
And I said, "Actually, it does. It's what the Nazis had used to identify a gay man during the Holocaust when you were interned in the concentration camp."
Whoa.
And I remember his response, which took me by surprise. It was, "Why didn't I know that?"
Good for him.
Exactly. So it was all this part of our own history, particularly in Vermont, how we got all of the proactive legislation we have in place. When did that happen? How did it happen? Who was involved in that process?
Right.
And more importantly, with everything that's happening on a federal level, how do we protect it? How do
Right.
we ensure that it stays the law of Vermont?
Well, and you've been involved in this for a long time, right?
For a day or two.
Since 85,
Yes.
86.
85.
And we've seen a tremendous amount of change in the last decade or two on social issues like LGBTQIA issues.
You did good at that.
I'll have it down by the end of the night.
Okay.
And so we've seen a tremendous amount of progress, particularly here in Vermont, but I think also around the country. Even you mentioned Texas as a state that has introduced a lot of legislation against the LGBTQIA community.
And their business community is standing up and saying you're making a mistake.
Exactly.
Rather than being exclusionary, you need to be inclusionary. There's a whole level of social change that's happening that is continuing to grow regardless of what is happening on that federal level
Right.
with executive orders, et cetera. I want to give another praise to her boy Phil, because one of the things that you're talking about and what I've seen over the years, Vermont has done this very much in a very public forum. It hasn't been by litigation and court action. It's
Right.
been in the legislature, it's been public hearings, it's people going out and talking at libraries
Right.
and any organization that would invite us. And over the years, watching legislators and elected officials, you could see their opinion change. You could
Right.
see it grow.
Right.
During Phil's most recent campaign, he identified that when he was first elected to the Senate, it was on the Take Vermont Back platform, and that over the years, he came to look at it entirely differently so that he could then vote for marriage equality,
Right.
which, is exactly what you're saying.
Well, just as society as a whole, you've seen they've done opinion polls, from public opinion, should X, Y, and Z be legal or whatever. From the early 2000s to just a couple of years ago, you've seen the numbers flip
Yep.
totally. You've seen a total sea change, and that's almost unheard of to see that much of a change in societal, perceptions within the span of a decade. And
actually, that kind of explains how we got to where we are right now. Whenever you're advocating for social change and you're sort of pushing forward, there's a segment that's going to be pushing back. I like things the way they are. I don't want you changing my life. I don't want you to try and change, how I feel, how I think, and who is my neighbor. So as you move forward, there's that push back, and then there's a push forward again, and that's where either lasting change truly happens, or you kind of lose.
or you lose steam.
Yeah.
Well, and I can think of two major social issues that over the same time period were massively successful, I think. And one of them was abortion.
Yep.
Under mostly Planned Parenthood was the big driver behind that, and then LGBTQIA issues, and there's a whole bunch of things that are packed into that. But both campaigns are massively successful within the span of a decade. And it's pretty incredible, actually, to think about the amount of social change that's happened in that time period.
And how it happened, and in Vermont, how it happened. And I keep saying that the credit for the change goes to the community at large. I could be sitting in the State House and testifying in front of committees. They're going to look at me and say, aha, you're the person who's supposed to be here, and you're going to be telling us all the facts and figures, da-da-da-da-da. But then they went home, and they got the phone call saying, I'm one of your constituents. Right. Or, the niece comes in and says, Uncle, I have something to tell you. Right. It was very much that person-to-person, grassroots level that really brought the change.
I think it was based on education and understanding rather than in-your-face threats like some of the other movements we've got going on these days. That's breaking windows. It was done quietly, and they wanted you to understand.
Yep.
Right.
And sometimes when we just talked about it before, I was testifying in one of the committees, and I kept saying preference. And Keith afterwards came up to me very graciously and said, no.
Orientation.
It's orientation, and here's why. Because you added that. And instead of, what are you, a fool, it's this instead of that. You just quietly told me why, and I went, oh, well, that makes sense. And so I changed.
What you know is what you've been taught.
Right.
And until someone gives you a different piece of information, that's what holds.
Right.
I mean, before this started, we were talking about the time that I spent helping to train law enforcement officers. And I would start with them with, I'm not going to beat you up for what it is that you have for information, because what has been taught. What I'd like to talk with you about is, where did you hear this?
Right.
What meaning did it have at that point in time? If it's changed, what helped it change?
Right.
And if it hasn't, why has it stayed the same? And then let's talk about, what do you do now to ensure that you're a good law enforcement officer?
That's good.
Because I have faith in them.
I keep thinking about the officer that asked you about the.
I know.
did not know that. Good for him.
I remembered.
So
Yeah.
I was impressed.
We were talking about. I have a whole list of all the people that have.
You haven't even
talked
gotten past
on your
page
show.
one.
I know we're moving along because there's a couple of ones I really want to ask you. But which one of those interviews really stuck out for you? Which one really impact? But they're all so great. You've got playwrights, you've got directors of nonprofits,
and average people. I mean, one of the memorable ones was early on, 2 individuals who identified as transgender who were just sitting there saying, this is who I am and this is what my life is like. Safe harbor for teen
yes,
youth.
safe. Thank you for saying that. That was mine.
And the reason it stands out for me is from what you all didn't get to see. They're a family. Penny, Charles, their transgender son, Marcus. And during the taping, as Ann was interviewing, Linda and I were sitting over in the corner and watching, and there was a point at which Penny said, teens who come into their house, and she talks to them about sex, and you could see Marcus just sort of, oh gosh, she's going to do it now. Just that embarrassment kind of. Exactly. And there were times that Marcus would be talking, so the camera would be on him, but if you saw the expression on Penny's face, or if you saw how Charles looked at Penny,
I liked her interview because she was very, I guess, I don't know, normal, but she admitted it was hard for her at the beginning. Very hard. She didn't understand, so she had to learn and grow and support her son. Ben, the dad, too, the same thing. So they were just normal, like you said. They're taught one way
people.
And challenged with, their son coming to them, and now they're 100% behind him and helping others. So.
What I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Well, and I think that's why doing a show like this is so important, and what you're doing is so important, because it's about understanding, right? Telling stories so that people can understand, and some of the stuff is uncomfortable to talk about, right?
Yeah.
But it's important to get it out there and to talk about it, because otherwise
this is
nothing
Pat
happens.
and I sitting at the tap room, but that well, and in the other interviews that really got my attention was, Peter Jacobson from Vermont Cares, and when Melissa came from Outright, because those were nonprofit, those were organizations that I helped found. But that was 30 years ago.
Wow.
This is what our idea was of what we thought was needed. So what's happened in the 30 years? Were we right? Are you growing? Are you thriving?
It's a whole different world.
Oh, exactly.
30 years, yeah.
Well, so I just have to tell you, there was one video, the Dancing Queens.
Yes.
You've got to watch this on the vid. It's India's first transgender dance troupe, which I
Yep.
think in itself, speaking of countries that don't accept this.
A whole lot.
No. And here all these people are out dancing and being very successful, but
And they dress
oh,
fabulous.
and very talented.
Yeah.
So the thing that just struck me was the gentleman that was hosting. They said, "We hope that somebody will come and fight for us,
Yep.
but we never think there's a hero in us." And I thought, wow, that is a very powerful.
Yeah.
And that goes back to the, it's your neighbor leaning across the fence saying,
Right.
"Did you know this?"
Right. It was
And
just
that's
you've
the
got it in
heroic
you.
motion.
Stand
Yeah.
up and do it. I was very impressed with that video.
Well, there's a whole bunch of organizations that you've had on your show, but also
Yeah.
work in this community. And just to name a couple, and we've mentioned some of them: Outright Vermont,
Yep.
the Green Mountain Crossroads, ACLU, VT, Vermont Diversity Health Project, the Samara Fund, UVM Advocate Center, UVM Transgender Resources, Human Rights Commission. There's a whole bunch of them. Is there any coordinated statewide umbrella that kind of helps to keep
Interesting
them
that
all
you
together?
should ask. And yeah, there is a newly forming organization. It's the LGBTQIA Alliance of Vermont.
Okay.
And it had its genesis with the Rainbow Umbrella Group of Central Vermont. Linda and Ann again. They're just troublemakers.
Attention seekers, right? They want the video.
They want the toaster oven. Following the election and looking at the people who were being appointed to the federal cabinet, they all had incredibly anti-LGBTQIA records.
Right.
I mean, there was no doubt about it.
At the
knew-
presidential.
At the
Yeah,
federal level.
Okay.
At the federal level. I'm very clear saying federal level.
That's what I thought. I wanted-
Yeah.
Not here in Vermont. No.
Vermont,
No.
they've done incredible things, and they've stepped up at the time and made positive statements
Right.
about we are an inclusive state. We are all
Well,
Vermonters.
that was the
we
executive
truly,
order.
And we're not gonna
that,
tolerate-
we truly
Press
appreciate.
release that Phil just put out. The
Yeah.
government.
But we saw a need for the ability to communicate quickly among the established LGBTQIA organizations and just local everyday citizens. And how were we going to do that? And we brought all of the individuals who represented an organization and interested parties. There is the people who are involved in Freedom to Marry. That group of volunteers has still stayed together to share information. How could we create a structure whereby, were something to happen or an action to be needed, we could get information out as quickly as possible? As a piece of that, I brought up that we had this position of liaison to the Office of the Governor and State Government that we had retired, thinking, and because people thought, oh, the work is
It's all done. Yes.
Yeah.
Move
It's like,
on.
no. I kept saying the work is not done. Maintaining it is where the true effort comes.
Right.
So I offered to step back into that role and try and reestablish a relationship with the Office of the
That's
Governor,
great.
who has been very receptive. The Lieutenant Governor, Attorney General, Speaker of the House, President Pro Tem. But I said, I've retired from this once. We need to look at someone else learning this process. And fortunately, Brenda Churchill, who identifies as a transgender woman, stepped forward and said, I think I want to do this.
Great.
And to her credit, Brenda truly has the fire in the belly.
Good.
And she continues to drive statewide to meet with all of
Good
those
for her.
organizations you mentioned, all of this, what you would expect to be the allied organizations, community groups. She's talking with groups of law enforcement officers. You have an interest. She is there to answer your questions.
Because I would think if you had a structure, you'd even have more clout and more
Exactly.
force behind you. Because I was thinking, when you're up testifying and you say the LGBTQ community, well,
You need somebody to
who's-
pick up that phone and
yeah,
call.
but
and
who said you are?
Yep.
Yeah, that's what you think, and,
Yep.
and people around you, but maybe not the
And
community.
how do you get that information? So
Yeah.
we're looking at trying to reestablish an idea of the town meeting day forums that happen
Good.
around the state.
Excellent.
And putting out ongoing scheduled sort of liaison reports. These are the things going on. What's your input?
Yeah.
What am I missing
You know,
here?
because you have, I mean, I don't even know who's in charge of the parades, who's in charge of the special events. It just seems to happen without any structure, which is
Well-
a good thing, but a structure.
Well, and that was the other part of this, is that organizations get to share what it is they're doing.
Right.
You know,
Perfect.
such as Green Mountain Crossroads has a summit at the end of this month, which is sort of their community forum, where people come together, share information, talk about where do we want to go, how do we want to grow. Well, we now can share that summit statewide, so that somebody
That's
in the
great.
Northeast Kingdom who may not have access to those kinds of information services can go to
Because I
Brattleboro
would
and
think if
participate.
I'm questioning youth or whatever,
Yeah.
where do you go? I know there may be in schools, but maybe even a young adult who needs help. Where do you go? There's no place to make that phone call. Because Outright Vermont is Outright Vermont. All of these things are sort of in
Most-
their own silos.
Most people end up calling, for youth, they will call the Trevor Project,
Oh, see,
which
I
is,
haven't heard of that.
it's a national hotline, and then the national hotline refers you back
Oh,
to Vermont.
good,
And Outright does have a statewide
right.
peer support line, that they have a toll-free number, so you can call in
Oh,
and you
good.
can talk to someone.
Okay.
There are, alliances in school districts around the state. They get together on an annual basis, and they talk about what are the things that they're doing. They can share projects, they can share work, they can share, this is the best way to approach this issue, or this is what we just encountered, get ready for it.
'Cause it is we just put a list together. I usually have 4 pages of typed notes, and that gets me through the hour. I have 6
Yeah.
with you, and I could have gone on a couple more because there are so many issues.
Yep.
It's very confusing. I mean, it must
Well,
be overwhelming if you're involved in this. I mean, what's the right answer for some of these things?
Well, sometimes the right answer is asking questions.
Oh, good,
And
good answer.
just sort of moving forward and, okay, what don't I know and what more do I need to know to make a decision on this? Talking about youth, there was the bill that went through this legislative session that originally, in its original language, was a youth could seek counseling regarding sexual orientation and gender identity issues without requiring parental consent.
Right.
And the intent behind that was, as I was growing up, I didn't have any idea what all of these emotions and feelings meant. So I might not pick up the phone and call Outright because I hadn't gotten to that place where
Right,
I understood
right.
that that's really where I wanted to go. So it would allow a youth to go into a counseling session and say, okay, I don't understand what's happening here. Can you help me figure this out? So that I can then come up with an idea of how I want to approach this, how I want to proceed with it. The youth could bring their family in at any point
Okay.
at which they
I was going
wanted.
to ask the family.
That was one of the questions that we had.
Sorry.
Well, there is, and this was one of the pieces when the bill was being debated. It was you're taking away parental rights. There is nothing in the language of the bill that says a parent can't be involved.
Right.
There is nothing in the
But nothing
language
can
that
happen
says
with the child without the parents.
you could go into an outpatient counseling situation
Right.
without having to require your parents' consent.
Okay. I don't
Now,
have a problem
but,
with that.
well, if you know a counseling procedure, one of the things that the therapist is always going to be looking at is how can we pull your family in?
Okay, good.
Or if the family is really the problem because they're not accepting and they're not going to be accepting, what is it that you're going to do to be able to continue to live?
Because we
within
just
your
said how
family?
important a family support
Absolutely.
is.
Right.
So you don't want to cut out the most important people in the young child's life.
But you also want to look at how you bring them in so
Right.
that all of
I-
a sudden you don't
Okay.
have this.
And it gives the teen the words to use,
Absolutely.
because I'm sure they
Well,
don't
and-
even know what to say or how to say it.
I didn't for
Yeah.
years. And when I finally figured it out and came out to my parents at a young age,
He said,
they looked at me and
It's
said,
about
pretty much.
Really?
Yeah,
Right.
it was, we always thought this, but it wasn't something we really knew anything about.
yeah,
And we thought rather than doing something wrong, we would let you find your own
good for
support
them.
people.
Wow,
So
I love your
that's-
mom and dad.
So do I.
Yeah,
And I gave them major bonus points for, this is why I'm still in your life, you're still in mine.
Right.
And actually, I wrote, and I will admit this on camera, I wrote a piece of testimony for the Senate committee when it was debating this. And the headline was, I'm writing in support of, and the name of the bill, and to publicly say that my mother was right.
kind of cool.
Because her comment was she hoped that I didn't think my parents didn't care about me, but they wanted to make sure
You had to
that
come to
I had the
terms with it
best
yourself.
resources.
Right.
And I said, actually, they had done everything right because I never felt as though I wasn't a part of the family.
Wow, nice.
So-
I wish everybody had that experience.
So do
That's
I.
good.
Well, and I can also see where a counselor can help a teen or young adult navigate if their
Absolutely.
family is not being supportive,
Right.
right? And how to handle that. I think probably there's some potential gray area in there if you're starting to talk about doing like a reassignment surgery or something like
Yeah,
that.
you need to bring the
That
parents.
gets into a whole
Right,
Yeah.
different
because that starts
area.
getting into a healthcare issue as opposed
Right.
to a self-identity
Yeah.
issue, right?
Yeah,
And
because I
this
was,
would
I was
not
a little
be-
vocal on the abortion issue with the parents' rights thing. I thought parents should know, but, so that's why when we were having this
I
discussion.
think I remember that, but I love her anyway. I love her anyway.
Anyway.
Well,
So,
and there's a number of issues that you talk about on your show, and Pat has a whole list of.
I got a list. Well, but the first thing though,
You got a lot of
check this out. You got to write this down. In doing my research for the show, there is on the YouTube, I think, Sherry Tart,
And Yolanda.
Cherie Tart, T-A-R-T-T, and
Yep.
Yolanda, who
Yep.
appear at the Flynn Theater.
Yep.
They arrive in all kinds of incredible outfits and on motorcycles. And
They can
Keith,
accessorize.
yes, yes. And Keith
I'll have to check this
goes,
out.
yeah, it's hysterical. And Keith is on the show with them, answering. You were answering questions
Yeah.
about what's new and legally and what's happening around the world. So you were there for an informative session, but
Yeah, I
could not have kept a straight face talking to those two. Seriously, they were.
Oh, they
are out there.
They acted up terribly.
Yes.
They're not on. They're not on anymore. That's all archived.
Oh, that's too bad. What a hoot!
They are-
I bet they filled the Flynn Theater. I bet they had a good.
Actually,
crowd.
they filmed it in a studio such as this.
Oh, really?
So it was a very intimate space. There was one episode that I remember that Barbara Snelling and I were the two guests.
Oh, stop!
Okay, talk about
I've got to find that one.
talk about your mixed assorted
Yeah.
nuts. She talked about education, and she would just engaged
Oh, yeah,
in
she's so
this
gracious.
typical conversation.
Yeah, right.
And then I came in to talk about politics. And
You've got to check
yeah.
it out. It's hysterical.
That
but anyway,
sounds like
so
it'd be hilarious. That'd be great.
we have got a list a mile long, and I don't know. We'll just jump in, and what we
Okay.
finish, we'll finish, because I'm going to may skip around because there's a few that I'd like to get in by the end of the show. But
Okay.
we've sort of talked about this. October 17th, you were at the historic marker on marriage
Yes.
equality, which I understand they carefully placed equally between the State House and the courthouse because it
David-
That was
all-
great symbolism.
Yeah, wasn't that wonderful?
well, and also David Sheets.
Oh God,
I didn't say that. Pat did.
I love him.
We were neighbors in
Oh,
Plainfield.
were you? Oh, I
yeah.
adored
And
David
Linda.
Sheets.
He said that there actually was a road that had been there.
Well, sure, there was.
Really?
That's where the first State House was.
Yes,
Down,
exactly.
and then it burned, and they can't find it exactly. So,
So it truly is a roadside marker.
Oh, I see.
Because that's the project, is
Yeah.
putting up these roadside markers. It was amazing to be there. It was more reaffirming than you would expect to see just this simple plaque. And part of it, as we were talking about all the LGBTQIA,
There's two Q's in there, I'm telling you.
and there could be two A's.
Oh, really?
Allied and asexual. So, and H for HIV. But, as we had talked about earlier, you're always waiting to hear the language come back that tells you that you're included.
Right.
That you're
That makes a lot of sense. When you keep adding letters, I'm like, what are you doing? But that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Because they need to feel part of the community.
And this marker does this. This marker says to Vermont's LGBTQIA communities, you're a part of our history.
Right.
You are part of what we hold as being important. This was a significant gesture.
Well, there must have
We're
been a
all
lot of
Vermonters.
people there.
Oh, it
We
was
were in
crowded.
Maine, but that's great. Isn't that cool?
I got to stand next to Justice Marilyn Goslant,
Oh.
who, as we were talking, we realized she is the only justice still on the court who was part of the Baker decision.
Oh, wow.
Right.
She's the remaining member who was part of the original.
And the girl singer from the
That-
Grand Ole Opry, do you know that? Marilyn? Remember the band from 100 years ago, the Grand Ole Opry?
Yeah,
She was the girl singer.
I didn't know that.
Our judge.
Marilyn, you've been revealed.
There you go. And she was the girl singer for years and years. I'd go there just to see our judge do that. Her singing. Good voice. So
Wow.
the other one I wanted to talk about, I'm going to skip around, but the conversion therapy
Yeah.
ban. There's 6 states, I think, but could you explain?
Conversion therapy, and this is specific to minors.
Yes, right. I'm sorry. Right.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
Conversion therapy is, you've identified as being LGBTQIA. I can teach you how to be straight. I can help you go through the process that you can live a life as a heterosexual woman or a heterosexual man.
Maybe not.
Maybe not. It has been debunked by every
Right.
credible source saying, no, it doesn't. All you're going to do is create conflict.
So these other states banned it because they
Yeah.
do
They
it.
agreed.
Where is it here in Vermont?
No, it's banned here in
It's
Vermont.
oh, good. I knew we would do that.
Now, however, one of the problems, Maine has been debating this issue, and the bill has gotten stalled in their House because what they realized is the manner in which they were writing their language, it would only prohibit a licensed therapist.
Oh, that's right. Oh, I remember reading that.
So if you were somebody who was within the faith-based community and said, I can do this for you,
Yeah.
but you weren't under that umbrella,
You could have
that piece of legislation didn't impact you.
completely
So-
untrained people and unlicensed people
Right.
to do this.
Yeah.
Which
That's
puts
great.
our youth at greater risk.
Yeah, because you
Great.
have someone who's no training in anything, really.
Can stumble through.
Can stumble through. Yeah.
Actually, future shows for All Things LGBTQ, building off youth, we're looking at bringing youth in like every couple of months and having their own 15-minute conversation about,
Excellent.
so what's happening for you?
Right.
What are the issues?
Yeah.
What's going on? Because at the June 10th Solidarity March that we had on the State House lawn here, and it was also in recognition of the massacre at the Pulse in Orlando, I had been told that at the end of the day, there really wasn't going to be anybody who wanted to participate in a speak out. And the adults from Outright said, this isn't a forum where our youth really feel comfortable and as
Right.
though they want to say something.
Yeah, you don't want to get up in front of a huge group of people and,
Yeah.
Let me tell you how wrong you were. When we got to the speak out, I said, I'm told there's no one interested. And then I looked over and I had 15 youth
Oh, yeah.
standing
amazing.
there
There you
saying
go. Good for
they
them.
wanted to talk.
Yeah.
And we heard them.
Right.
And one of the things they said is, don't forget we're here, that you've done all of this, supportive legislation and policy, but kids can be stupid at times.
Yeah, wow.
don't forget we're here.
They're not quite at the level of,
Yeah.
should I use the word maturity, I suppose. But
Well, and
this is-
storytelling is so powerful
Yeah.
because you learn so much.
Yeah.
Because everyone's
they're living it.
yeah, well, and people are afraid of things that they don't understand, or
Yeah.
they
Exactly.
and so understanding is really the key to acceptance, I think, in most cases.
Absolutely.
And so the storytelling is so powerful, I think, and getting those stories out there from kids about their experiences and their feelings and how they, and how they perceive themselves and how they've gone through this. Many people in the community have gone through this self-analyzing process that most people never go through.
Yeah.
And really to deconstruct themselves and figure out who they are. And sharing that, I think, is really powerful.
And I think what's cool is all around the state they're having groups of teens get together in very safe spaces, to use the current politically correct word, but it makes a lot of sense, where they're with their peers and they
The
can
Friday night
talk.
support groups.
Yeah, well, and I think that's important. I know
Absolutely.
we have one very successful one here in Montpelier.
Yes.
And we probably need a few more around the area, just for the kids to feel they've got a place to go.
They're always looking for adult mentors to help.
What did you, adult what?
Who do they call?
Oh, mentors. Okay, sorry. Misunderstood that word.
So switching switching
What
gears
did
a
he
little
say?
bit, and this wouldn't necessarily at first seem like an LGBTQIA issue, but Secretary of State Jim Condos
Yeah.
and the legislature has been resistant to submitting data on Vermont voters, and you have some concerns about that. What are those concerns, and what should people be aware of?
Well, one of the issues was that, looking at the LGBTQIA community and its intersectionality with other organizations, in many places, the type of information they're trying to gather is used to prohibit people of color from being able to vote.
Right.
That rather than encouraging voter participation, it is to suppress it. And that was our concern. That still is my concern, is that the most information you have and these detailed lists, then you're looking at, how can I remove you from the voting block? How can I make this a greater challenge for you to be able to go in and vote? And for those places for which you have to produce some kind of identification to show that you indeed are this person and can vote, if you're somebody who identifies as transgender and you are still in transition, you have not gone through the full reassignment process, your ID and the person standing in front of that clerk isn't going to match. So you may be denied the right to vote because you do not match.
Right. Your photo
ID
doesn't
card.
necessarily matter. And I can see how that would be
Right?
uncomfortable even
Right.
if it, did match, but your license says male and you don't identify as male or vice versa. I
If
can
I
see
come
that.
And they
with
won't
something
change
off
it,
the
as
shoulders
Keith
and
said,
stuff.
until everything's finished,
Completed.
because I was telling him before the show, an issue there was with a gentleman who was living as a woman, and so his license didn't match. And many years ago, before the police were trained and were as gracious as the guy you talked to, they were given this poor woman she'd call my office, please, please, please help me. And so I talked to the Commissioner of Public Safety, and after we fixed it.
Good.
And
Oh,
a
it was terrible.
And a positive thing that's happening now is that there's a growing movement to come up with a non-specific gender
Yeah, the
identification for IDs.
non-binary.
Non-binary.
Which is our next question.
Well,
Cross that
and we have been talking with Commissioner Ide from the Department of Motor Vehicle, who has agreed that this is something that will be happening here in Vermont. And actually, they're putting
think
out
it
an
makes a lot of
RFP
sense.
for a new software program. So it's the perfect timing
good.
to be able to come up with a gender MF and a gender X, so that, if it's one of those cases where
Right.
your
Right.
appearance does not match, there's no conflict.
Right. And non-binary basically means it's not either or.
Right.
Essentially, yeah.
There's a whole
That makes
conversation.
a lot
and
of sense. I wasn't understanding it till
Yeah.
you just said it, because I was home listening to this going, now, what? But that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I support it.
And one of the things that those of us who are sort of older need to get used to is that our youth coming up are looking at this concept of non-binary as there are all of these gender expectations on a societal and cultural level of how it is that I should act and present as a male or a female. Well, I don't want to agree to either of those.
Right.
So I'm saying that I am either asexual or non-binary.
Yeah.
I'm not going to buy into those.
And how? At what age would that be? When you get your license or voting? So you'd be 18,
Yeah.
right? Okay. Because I read a story about a couple who wants their child to be.
Canada's already done it.
Really? So as a
On
child,
their-
you can.
on your
the
birth
parents
certificate.
can.
The parent said, I do not want to raise my child in a binary system. I want them to be non-binary
Okay.
on their birth certificate.
And at 18 or whenever they can
They can do
choose
it.
to change. If
When
they
you're
so
age of
choose.
majority, you get lots
You
of
get to-
options that you
exactly.
didn't have before.
No, I read that.
So I
went, what?
assume that so that's for purposes of government identification
Yes.
as non-binary, because certainly there's healthcare identification in there might matter somewhat.
Actually, that becomes a very interesting conversation. It's when we collect these different pieces of information, why are we collecting them? And what purpose do they truly serve?
Right.
Right.
And if you really don't need it,
Exactly.
why are you including it?
Right.
One of the things that does happen is if you identify as a transgender woman, there are all of those birth control questions that get put into play that
Right.
really aren't applicable to
Right.
you.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
Do you know that's actually how we streamline DMV? I said to them, you collect this information. What do you do with it?
exactly.
Nothing. Then why the heck do you ask for it? Just
Right.
don't ask for it. Oh, but we need it. But why? And we had this big fight and we take it off the thing and nobody knew the difference. Just one less thing to fill out.
Were you the person who took race off the driver's license?
Probably.
Yeah.
Who cares?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I think actually it's an interesting
I
point.
got to say thank you.
See,
too.
there you go.
Is because you mentioned there's all these expectations, gender expectations
Yes.
attached to specific genders. In some ways, that translates into things like ethnicity as well,
Exactly.
and other I guess for lack of a better term, classifications. Although that I hate using that word, but
How we categorize
how we categorize.
and our expected outcomes from that.
Right, but there's expectations that go along with any kind of identity, I guess, not just gender identity, but all sorts of identity.
I think one of the things that is happening with all of the conversation regarding transgender, non-binary, asexual, is really challenging all of those expectations. And do they really hold? And aren't you the person who should be able to make those decisions for yourself? And what is it that I can do either as a part of your social network to support you in that process,
Right.
or at least not make it more difficult for you? I mean, because sometimes, looking at why are you collecting it and what are you
Right.
doing with this information, it's why am I making this harder for you than it really needs to
Right.
be?
Right.
Looking at the voter registration, we should be encouraging people to participate in this process. I kind of think is what the democratic process is all about.
You'd think.
I think it's why you're doing this show, which I appreciate. Is it's more than just the surface conversation.
Right.
These are the things you really need to know. Rather than making it more difficult for you, how can I make this a more accessible process for you?
Right.
How can I get you engaged?
Right. As opposed to sitting there on at the DMV maybe. Sorry, Pat.
One more.
Trying to taking 10 minutes trying to decide how do I answer
Yeah, this question.
the
right.
gender question or
Right.
or any other question.
Right.
You know.
Especially if they don't do anything with it. That's the part that killed me.
Right.
And we'd fight about it. I'm like, but we always, we've always
done
it.
that.
I mean, the only thing I can think of, why it might matter for the government to know what gender you identify as is selective service, and that's only because we.
We'll draft anything.
But that's gonna change soon, too.
Exactly, but that's changing too.
Exactly.
So what other reason do they have?
If and this gets into the ban on transgender in the military, if you
Oh,
have an
right.
interest in serving and you are capable of serving,
Right.
why should
not?
I deny you that
Right.
option?
Right.
And one of the pieces that we
As
keep
long as they don't as long as they don't lower, they have the
the
standards.
the standards
Do
are
the standards and you got my vote, but if they lower it, no.
No. The standards are the standards are the standards.
Right.
And that's been true looking at bringing women into different branches where they
Right,
had previously been denied. But one of the aspects that we keep forgetting about the military is that for some individuals, it's their chance at an education. It's their chance
Right.
of leaving, an adverse living
Yeah.
situation and working towards something better
Yeah.
for themselves. And we've just said that's not an option for you. And one of the issues that's going to be coming up is about minimum wage, and Maine did this as a referendum item during the last election. And one of the pieces that Equality Maine put out, which is their LGBTQIA political organization, they were saying that the LGBTQ community is underemployed, underpaid. The average transgender individual may earn a salary of $10,000 per year.
Ouch.
And that raising the minimum wage is the single most effective thing you could do to
Right.
combat that.
Right.
I was stunned.
That's incredible.
10,000.
That's
Well,
really incredible.
it's not what I had expected to see. It was not an issue for which I was actively engaged.
right.
I've been fortunate that I've been fully employed for 44 years.
Right, 10,000?
Yes.
Try feeding a family on that, or
Yeah, good
yourself
luck.
for that matter.
Yeah.
So we have 1 minute and 54 seconds. Can you do the bathroom, I don't know what the bathroom issue really quickly?
H333 is a bill that is going through the Vermont legislature. It has passed the House, it's going to the Senate. And the basis of the legislation is that if you have a single-use bathroom,
Right,
it is a gender-inclusive bathroom. It is open to anyone. What I didn't appreciate, and we started working on the bill, is that there is an application for your phone that the transgender community can access where you can find a bathroom that you can use.
really?
So this
Yeah.
goes beyond like the sign on the door having a man
Actually,
and a woman.
It says
or-
handicap, it says
If-
unisex or something.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Or it says family bathroom.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right,
Now it will merely say restroom.
excellent.
So there's no
I knew
identification.
we'd find a good, that's a great
Yeah.
compromise.
Yeah.
Good for us.
That's
I love
it.
Vermont.
Well, actually, when we talked to the governor about it, he looked at us and said, "Isn't that what we already do?"
I know. You kind of think about.
Exactly.
Don't we do that already? Kind
It's
of.
it's that common sense thing
Yeah.
that he's famous for. Keith, thank you very
Thank
much for
you.
coming. We have obviously run out of time, as you know from your show. And
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening in, everybody. We'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.